Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. My name is Chloe. I'm a French and British citizen currently working in climate policy in Germany, and my contribution will focus on national carbon commitments.
As you may have heard, commitments to climate neutrality are burgeoning around the world. The government of China, one of the world's biggest emitters, has recently announced a carbon neutrality goal by 2060. Notice the difference. Carbon neutrality means that carbon dioxide emissions are offset by carbon sinks, such as forests, wetlands, or by other technological means that we are about to scrutinize together. Climate neutrality, on the other hand, means that all greenhouse gases are accounted for, not just carbon dioxide, but also methane, for instance, which stays for a much shorter period of time in our atmosphere, 20 years compared to 100 for CO2, but is 30 times more potent as a heat-trapping gas. Hence, since methane traps more heat than CO2, it makes sense to incorporate all greenhouse gases into our climate targets. So, let us first find out what climate neutrality really means. Climate neutrality refers to a state in which the activities of an individual or an organization, a city or a country result in net zero greenhouse gases emissions. Net zero emission means that all man-made greenhouse gas emissions must be removed from the atmosphere. You can think of it as a giant accountancy book. If I add emissions on one side, I ought to remove just as much emissions via natural or artificial sinks on the other side in order to maintain the Earth's net climate balance. Complicated, you say? Well, for now, policymakers have not found better than a giant balance sheet to organize carbon commitments around the world. So then, for human activities to be climate neutral, either the activities themselves are associated with zero emissions, just like you and me riding a bicycle, for example, or the greenhouse gases released by the activities must be offset by sequestering an equivalent amount of CO2 elsewhere. Currently, CO2 is the only greenhouse gas that can be sequestered from the atmosphere. I will take questions in a few minutes, but keep in mind the idea of a giant balance sheet. The emissions from one activity somewhere can be balanced out by CO2 sequestration elsewhere. This is called carbon offsetting and has been around for a long time. The problem we face today is that even if emissions from one activity are offset by reducing or avoiding emissions elsewhere, there is still a net release of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This is where the Paris Agreement comes in. Climate negotiations before the Conference of the Parties in Paris in 2015 had been based, implicitly or explicitly, on the idea that global warming would depend on the total amount of greenhouse gas emitted into the atmosphere. Signing up for limiting the Earth's temperature rise would mean setting the specific total amount of emissions reduction required in order to reach a goal and the rate at which emissions should be cut. Major emitters, however, were not able or willing to promise cuts on the scale needed for respecting the widely accepted limit of a 2-degree temperature increase. Paris changed this deadlock in two ways. First, the agreement set up a ratcheting mechanism, meaning that policies to cut emissions would get more and more ambitious over time. In plain words, countries could sign up today while promising to be more ambitious tomorrow. The second, most subtle method is the possibilities for countries to resort to negative emissions. Yes, you heard me well. There is such a thing as producing something negative. Negative emissions take greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, and they are officially needed in order to stabilize global warming at 1.2 degrees. So then, the stable level of greenhouse gas that is imagined for the second half of the 21st century is not achieved only by the absence of all human-related emissions, but also by the advent of technologies or policies that remove already emitted carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. If positive and negative emissions are in balance, the net zero emission world is created. Now I know this is a lot to take in, and I hope you will bear with me for the next minutes, because I will now get into the nitty-gritty of this net zero emissions world. Large-scale carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, also known as negative emissions, aim to address climate change by removing carbon dioxide permanently from the atmosphere. Now, trees also sequester carbon, of course, but only up to a certain point. Trees don't grow into the sky. As we are seeing around the world, forests are exposed to wildfires, savage harvesting, and they are vulnerable to changes in political regimes. Counting exclusively on forests to store carbon is unwise in the long run, since it might very well be impermanent. Other technologies are being considered to capture carbon and store it underground or under the ocean floor. If deployed at a planetary scale, CDR, or carbon dioxide removal, could help prevent ocean acidification and slow the rate of global warming. But these technologies also come with a great deal of uncertainties and pitfalls. For example, the amount of land required to deploy them at scale could threaten food security around the world, since a large part of arable land would then be dedicated to monocultures. These crops would fix carbon and be burned to create energy. Only the carbon emitted would then be captured and stored under the Earth's surface. This technique is called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, also known as BECCS, and is central to all policy scenarios, allowing us to reach 1.5 degrees in temperature rise. Large-scale deployment is expected to start as of 2030. This is what I want to draw your attention to. Carbon commitments are based on already technologies that ought to be deployed on a very large scale, which gives us little room for trial and error. If we are to avoid lock-in into inappropriate techniques, we need to scrutinize not just the targets, but the policies and research programs that support these goals. Listen to the science is an important message for policymakers, but science is never neutral. In fact, it is very political. Most countries researching these technologies at the moment are based in northern universities with little cooperation among northern and southern countries. So, some countries have already adopted the climate neutrality goal and even announced a target date for reaching this objective. While it is good news to announce ambition, how exactly are governments intending to reach the balance between their emissions and their removal is the questions we need to ask. Thank you for your attention.